In the heart of a bustling city, where dreams were forged and sometimes shattered, there was a small diner named the Corner Table. It had seen better days, the neon sign flickering intermittently, and the booths were worn, but it still held a charm that drew in regulars and newcomers alike. The smell of coffee and breakfast food wafted through the air, mingling with the chatter of patrons and the clinking of plates. Among the waitstaff was a young man named Jake. He was in his mid-20s, with tousled hair and kind blue eyes that sparkled even during the busiest morning rush. But life had not been kind to him lately. He had recently lost his mother and was struggling to pay rent while trying to keep his head above water. Each day, he forced a smile, determined to make the best of his situation, even when the weight of the world pressed down on his shoulders. On one particularly busy Saturday morning, the diner was packed. The clatter of dishes filled the air, and the sound of laughter resonated from every corner. Jake moved swiftly between tables, taking orders and delivering food with a sense of urgency. He was determined to make this day a good one, even if it meant sacrificing his own happiness. Meanwhile, a man named Richard sat at a booth in the corner, oblivious to the chaos around him. He was in his late 30s, dressed in a tailored suit that screamed success. His expensive watch glinted under the diner's fluorescent lights, and he had an air of superiority about him. He looked down at his phone, scrolling idly, his expression a mix of impatience and disdain for the world around him. As Jake approached Richard's table, he smiled, hoping to bring a little warmth to the man's demeanor. "Good morning. What can I get for you today?" he asked, his voice bright and welcoming. Richard barely glanced up from his phone. "About time. I've been waiting ages. Just get me a coffee and the special," he snapped, his tone laced with arrogance. Jake nodded, trying to suppress the sting of the man's rudeness. He hurried off to fulfill the order. But Richard's disdain didn't end there. When Jake returned with the steaming cup of coffee and the daily special, he was met with a scowl. "Is this the best you can do? The coffee is lukewarm. You should be ashamed of yourself," Richard barked, his voice dripping with condescension. Jake's heart sank. He had poured his effort into ensuring everything was perfect, but it seemed it would never be enough for this man. "I'm really sorry about that, sir. I'll be happy to bring you a fresh cup," Jake offered, his voice steady despite the hurt rising in his chest. Richard rolled his eyes. "Whatever. Just make it quick. I don't have all day to waste on a loser like you," he retorted, leaning back in his booth as if he were above the whole situation. The words cut deep. Jake had faced his share of challenges, but hearing such utter disdain from a stranger felt like a punch to the gut. He quickly turned away, fighting back tears as he headed back to the counter, where he filled a fresh cup of coffee and took a deep breath to regain his composure. As the morning rush continued, Jake did his best to keep his spirits up, serving other patrons with kindness and warmth. But Richard's words hung heavily in his mind, making it harder to focus. He couldn't shake the feeling of inadequacy, of being less than the world expected him to be. After what felt like an eternity, the morning crowd began to thin. Jake took a moment to catch his breath, wiping his brow as he leaned against the counter. Just then, the bell above the door jingled, announcing the arrival of a new customer. "Hey Jake, how's it going?" A cheerful voice called from the entrance. It was Sarah, one of Jake's closest friends and fellow waitstaff. She had a contagious smile and an optimistic outlook on life that always lifted Jake's spirits. "Just surviving, you know," Jake replied, forcing a smile. "How about you?" "I'm good. Just got off my shift at the bakery. Thought I'd come by to hang out for a bit," Sarah said, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "You should take a break. I can cover for you." Jake shook his head. "I can't. Not with the way things have been lately. I need the hours." Sarah frowned, concern etched on her face. "You know I'm always here for you if you need to talk, right?" "Yeah, I know," Jake replied, grateful for her friendship. "I appreciate it, really." As Jake returned to his duties, he couldn't help but glance at Richard, who was still seated in his booth, now engrossed in his laptop. The man's demeanor hadn't shifted. He seemed utterly unaware of the impact of his words, lost in his own world. Hours passed, and as the diner began to wind down for the day, Jake felt a sense of relief wash over him. He had made it through another shift. Just as he was about to clock out, the door swung open, and a group of people entered, chattering animatedly. Among them, Jake spotted Richard, now joined by a woman and two men. "Is that the same waiter?" one of the men said, pointing at Jake as they approached the counter. "Looks like it," Richard replied, a smirk plastered across his face. "He's a real piece of work." Jake's heart sank again. He could feel their eyes on him, judging him, and for a moment, he wanted to disappear. But he stood tall, determined not to let their mockery affect him. "Welcome to the corner table. What can I get for you?" he asked, forcing a smile despite the tension in the air. Richard leaned back, crossing his arms with a smug expression. "I'll have the burger, medium rare. And make sure it's cooked properly this time," he sneered. Jake nodded, trying to maintain his composure, while the laughter of Richard's friends echoed around him. As he walked away to place the order, Jake couldn't shake the feeling of anger and embarrassment swirling inside him. Why did people like Richard feel the need to belittle others? He was exhausted from trying to please everyone, especially those who didn't deserve his efforts. After handing the order to the kitchen, Jake returned to the table, placing the burger in front of Richard with a forced smile. Richard didn't even acknowledge him as he dug in with the same arrogance he had displayed all day. "Do you have any idea what you're doing?" one of Richard's friends asked, watching Jake. "You really should consider a different line of work." The words stung, and Jake bit back the urge to defend himself. Instead, he took a deep breath, reminding himself that he was doing the best he could in a tough situation. As the evening wore on, the diner closed, and Jake finally clocked out. He felt drained, but also relieved to be free from the judgmental gazes of Richard and his friends. The next day, the diner was abuzz with chatter as Jake and Sarah worked the morning shift. Jake was in better spirits, determined to shake off the negativity from the previous day. He was preparing to take another order when the bell above the door jingled again, announcing a new arrival. To his shock, it was Richard, this time without his entourage. He walked in with a briefcase, looking more serious than before. "Hey you," Richard called, spotting Jake. "I need to speak to you." Jake's heart raced. "What is it?" he asked, trying to maintain his composure. "I'm looking for a new apartment," Richard said, leaning against the counter. "I heard you live in the area?" Jake's mind raced. Richard, his rude customer, was now asking about his living situation? "Yeah, I have a small place," he replied cautiously. "Could you give me some recommendations? I'm looking for something decent, but not too expensive," Richard continued, his tone shifting slightly. Jake hesitated, uncertain of how to respond. "I'm not really sure. I don't know much about the market," he said, trying to keep the conversation polite. Richard frowned, sensing Jake's reluctance. "Come on, man. I'm just trying to make conversation." "You don't have to be so defensive," he snapped. Jake felt a surge of anger rise within him. "You know, it's hard to have a civil conversation when you've insulted me repeatedly," he shot back, surprising even himself with his boldness. Richard looked taken aback, his expression shifting from arrogance to something resembling humility. "I didn't mean to upset you. I've had a rough week, okay?" he admitted, running a hand through his hair. The unexpected vulnerability caught Jake off guard. "We all have our struggles," he said softly, his anger dissipating as he saw a hint of sincerity in Richard's eyes. "Yeah, I guess that's true," Richard replied, his voice softer now. "I'm just trying to find a place to live. My landlord is selling the building, and I'm scrambling to find a new place before I get kicked out." Jake's heart softened. Maybe Richard wasn't as invincible as he seemed. "Well, I can ask around for you. I know a few people who might have leads," Jake offered, surprising himself with his willingness to help. "Really? That would be great, man. Thanks," Richard said, the weight of his earlier arrogance lifting slightly. Just then, Sarah walked over, her eyes wide as she took in the scene. "What's going on here?" she asked, glancing between the two men. "Just talking about apartments," Jake said, trying to keep things light. Richard nodded, an almost sheepish look on his face. "Yeah, I'm looking for a new place. Jake here is going to help me out." Sarah raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "You? Helping him?" she asked, a hint of disbelief in her voice. "Believe it or not, we're making progress," Jake replied, sharing a small smile with Richard. As the day continued, an unlikely friendship began to form. Richard started visiting the diner more frequently, and each time he and Jake would engage in light banter, slowly peeling back the layers of their initial animosity. Jake learned that Richard was not just a wealthy businessman. He was also a man facing his own demons, struggling with loneliness and the pressures of success. As the weeks turned into months, Richard became a regular fixture at the corner table. He and Jake developed a camaraderie that surprised both of them. Jake found himself laughing more, enjoying Richard's company, and even sharing stories about their lives. One day, Richard dropped a bombshell. "You know, I'm actually moving into one of my properties. I bought a new building, and it has some vacant apartments. I'm going to be your landlord," he announced, a grin spreading across his face. Jake's heart dropped. "Wait, what?" he exclaimed, trying to process the information. "Yeah, I always wanted to own a building, and now I finally did. I'll be your landlord starting next month," Richard said proudly. Jake felt a whirlwind of emotions. The man who had once insulted him was now going to be in a position of authority over him. "This is unexpected," he managed to say. Richard chuckled. "I know, right? But I promise I'll be a fair landlord." "No more insults, I swear," he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "Let's hope so," Jake replied, a smile creeping onto his face. With their relationship evolving, Jake began to see Richard in a different light. He was no longer just the arrogant man who had once belittled him. He was a person grappling with his own life challenges. Their friendship deepened, and as the weeks passed, Richard became a source of support for Jake. He would often check in, offering words of encouragement and advice when things got tough at work. Jake, in turn, helped Richard navigate his new role as a landlord, sharing insights about the tenants and the building. As the transition approached, Jake felt a mix of anticipation and trepidation. He had grown fond of Richard, but could their friendship survive the complexities of landlord-tenant dynamics? The day finally arrived when Richard took over the building. Jake felt a flutter of nerves as he stood in front of the door to his apartment, waiting for Richard to arrive. When Richard knocked, Jake opened the door, unsure of what to expect. "Hey, I'm here to officially welcome you to the new management," Richard said with a grin, holding a small housewarming gift, a potted plant. Jake couldn't help but smile. "Thanks. I guess this means I'm stuck with you as my landlord now," he joked, taking the plant from Richard's hands. "Just think of it as an opportunity for friendship," Richard replied, his tone light. As they settled into this new phase of their relationship, Jake found that having Richard as a landlord was not as daunting as he had imagined. Richard was fair and approachable, treating Jake like a friend rather than a subordinate. Their bond grew stronger, and they often found themselves sharing meals together, discussing life, and supporting each other through challenges. One evening, while they were sitting on the balcony of Jake's apartment, Richard opened up about his struggles with loneliness and the pressures of maintaining a successful image. "Sometimes, I feel like I have to wear a mask to hide my true self. It's exhausting," he confessed, his gaze distant. Jake nodded, understanding the weight of Richard's words. "You don't have to pretend with me. I appreciate you for who you are, not what you have," he said sincerely. Richard smiled, a look of gratitude washing over his face. "Thanks, Jake. That means a lot. I've learned a lot from you, about humility and kindness." As time went on, their friendship blossomed into something deeper. They found solace in each other, navigating the complexities of their lives together. Jake helped Richard see the beauty in the simple things, while Richard encouraged Jake to pursue his dreams and believe in himself. One fateful evening, as they sat on the balcony, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, Richard turned to Jake with a serious expression. "I want to thank you for being my friend. You've changed my life," he said earnestly. Jake felt a rush of warmth at Richard's words. "And you've changed mine. I never expected to find a friend in my landlord," he replied, laughter bubbling between them. Richard took a deep breath, his gaze locking onto Jake's. "I've been thinking, I want you to be part of something bigger. I'm starting a community project to help struggling waitstaff and low-income families. I'd love for you to help me with it," he proposed. A spark of excitement ignited within Jake. "Really? That sounds incredible. I'd love to help," he said, his heart swelling with purpose. As they embarked on this new journey together, Jake realized that life had a way of bringing unexpected people into his path, teaching him valuable lessons about kindness, resilience, and the power of friendship. Richard, once a source of pain, had transformed into a beacon of hope and support. Months passed and the community project flourished. They organized workshops, provided resources for struggling families, and created a network of support for those in need. Jake and Richard became a dynamic duo, their friendship solidifying with each passing day. But life had one more twist in store. One fateful afternoon, as they were preparing for an event, Jake received a phone call that changed everything. His landlord had unexpectedly decided to sell the building, and he was being forced to move out. Panic set in as Jake realized he would have to leave the apartment he had come to love. He rushed to find Richard, his heart racing. "Richard, I just got the call. I have to move out," Jake said, desperation in his voice. Richard's expression shifted from shock to determination. "No way. We can't let that happen. I'll help you find a new place. You're not going anywhere," he declared, his eyes fierce with resolve. Together, they began searching for a new apartment, scouring listings and visiting potential homes. Richard's support was unwavering, and for the first time in a long time, Jake felt a sense of hope. After countless viewings, they finally found a cozy apartment that felt like home. As they signed the lease, Jake couldn't help but feel grateful for the journey that had brought them together. In the end, it was Richard's kindness and support that carried Jake through the toughest of times. Their friendship had transformed from a chance encounter into a deep bond that would last a lifetime. As they stood outside the new apartment, Richard turned to Jake with a grin. "Welcome home, my friend. Here's to new beginnings," he said, raising an imaginary toast. Jake chuckled, his heart full. "And to the unexpected twists of fate that brought us together." With their laughter echoing in the air, they stepped inside, ready to embrace the future together. What a wild journey of unexpected twists, from insults to friendship, and now, Jake's life is turning in yet another shocking direction. This story shows how sometimes people can surprise you, whether it's a rude customer turning into a supportive landlord or a relationship blossoming in the most unlikely of circumstances. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to stay updated on all our latest content. Don't forget to like the video if it touched your heart, comment your thoughts below, and share it with friends who need a reminder that kindness and change can happen when you least expect it. Thanks for being part of the journey.